Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe good evening. Depends where are you. And so my name is Marcin Maciąg, and I am the CEO and co-founder of the LifeLine Diagnostic Laboratory from Europe, which specializes in elemental hair analysis. And I welcome all of our international partners to a training session about elemental hair analysis tests. Today's meeting is the result of our cooperation with the Indian Association of Functional Medicine. And thanks to this, we can discuss the idea of our test with our
This meeting is being recorded
from India. For this reason, one of the moderators, one of the hosts of today's meeting will be Dr. Anish Musa. Dr. Musa is a functional medicine practitioner certified by the Institute of Functional Medicine in the US. He did MBBS and MS from University Vadodara, Gujarat. He's also certified internationally in the field of ophthalmology, thyroid, and integrated medicine. He has more than 20 years of clinical experience, and he is keenly interested in research and reversal of chronic disease through the functional medicine approach. The second host is John Bumpus from Australia. He is a hair tissue mineral analysis practitioner and natural medicine practitioner that specializes in mineral balancing science and natural detoxification. And John will tell us about the details of the hair tests and the ways of its interpretation. He is a senior fellow of the Society of Natural Therapists and Researchers and founder of the Mineral Balancing Academy. Today's meeting has two parts. The first one, it will be a lecture about the test that will be reversed by John. And the second part, the Q&A session, will be moderated by Dr. Musa. So I'm sure that it will be very valuable meeting for all of us. And let's start. John, it's a great honor to have you on today's meeting, and please start your presentation.
Thank you. Very, very much appreciated. And thank you everyone for gathering today because we have a lot in store. I'm just wondering if I can share my screen maybe, and I can show slides. Thank you. I imagine you guys can see the presentation now. Okay, cool. All right, so welcome again, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the Indian Association of Functional Medicine and LifeLine Diagnostics for bringing this presentation together and making it available to you guys. We have a lot to cover today, so hopefully it doesn't seem too overwhelming, but if you really need to, we will be sending the slides out to you guys as well if you feel like you need them. So I guess I should tell a little bit about me. Marcin already did a wonderful introduction, but he pretty much covered everything. The only thing I'd like to add is that we also do a free podcast that's available on YouTube. It's called the Mineral Minded Podcast, where we kind of specialize in talking about natural detoxification, but also natural medicine and hair tissue mineral analysis. And we try and gather a lot of practitioners in this field so that we can have a chat about, our unique perspectives together. Now, today we're going to be talking about elemental hair analysis. And if we're going to talk about it for those that might not be aware of what it is, I guess I should explain what it is. So elemental hair analysis is a functional screening test that measures the the nutrients and toxic elements that are present in a hair sample. And it indicates a lot of potential health issues and nutritional imbalances by pinpointing different element levels and ratios where it matters the most, which is the cellular level. Now, an elemental hair analysis is the term that LifeLine Diagnostics uses, and I will use it in this presentation. But if you do search a little bit more online, you'll find that people also use the term hair tissue mineral analysis, or HTMA. But I want to be clear that elemental hair analysis, HTMA, they are the same thing. So just so you guys know, if you feel like you're going to do further research after this presentation. Now, there are many different ways to read and interpret an elemental hair analysis, but they're not all the same. There's a couple of different camps on how to interpret this test, but I will say that just because they have a difference in interpretation doesn't mean that they produce the same results clinically. But when you use an elemental hair analysis through the mineral balancing perspectives, we can reveal at a simple glance, sometimes quicker than you would expect, especially if you have some experience with this test, a large amount of valuable clinical information that can relate to both physical and mental health. We won't get too much in detail as far as mineral balancing in this presentation, but I will say that a lot of the information we're going to be talking about today was originally developed in the United States by Dr. Paul Eck and Dr. David Watts in the 1970s and 1980s. So there's over 50 years of experience and interpretation and what these values mean and the information that comes up from it. Now, in my opinion, it does take several years of experience to really get comfortable using this test, at least to get the full gamut of what this test can offer. But my goal in this presentation is to really give you some information that you can start to use now clinically, as well as kind of get a taste for the full potential of hair testing. Now, the data from an elemental hair analysis, when properly interpreted, can offer really important insights into tissue nutritional status and imbalances. This includes excesses and deficiencies. We can also see not just overt deficiencies, but we can see relative deficiencies, which is a unique and forthcoming area of nutritional science. We can also get an idea about tissue heavy metal burdens or toxicities, and hair testing itself is often used for this purpose when most people use it, but it's only one aspect of the use of a hair tissue mineral analysis or an elemental hair analysis. We can also get a lot of insights into energy and vitality at the cellular level, nervous system activity, whether it's the parasympathetic activity of the autonomic nervous system or the sympathetic activity, and we can assess which dominance these individuals are experiencing over a period of time. Get insights on glandular function, primarily adrenal, but also thyroid. And this isn't blood thyroid test. This is a cellular level. So we'll get into this a little later, but it's not necessarily always the same. We can get insights on blood sugar regulation, digestion, and immune compromisations. And this is really unique because you don't always have to test which microorganism you're dealing with. You can get many insights with just a hair test. And we have also mentioned in the past already about psychological health, and there's really a lot more that you can also assess, but we'll just try and keep it onto one slide today. So generally, the information that's provided by an elemental hair analysis is used to identify metabolic trends, but it can be used in addition to other tests, especially if you're a licensed physician, which I know at least the Indian Association of Functional Medicine that are sitting in this situation. You can use a hair test in addition to other tests for diagnostic or trying to identify different diagnostic criteria. Now, it's not necessary to be a physician to use elemental hair analysis to help your clients. Mineral balancing practitioners, for example, oftentimes use an elemental hair analysis within the scope of what they've trained in, but they'll often use it to provide nutritional supplementation or lifestyle counseling, and also maybe other modalities such as chiropractic and stuff. They might integrate this testing as well in their practice. And with all this being said, when a mineral balancing practitioner does get faced with a situation that's a little bit more advanced or outside of their scope of practice, they usually refer that client to a licensed health professional. So it's very important for these licensed health professionals to have an understanding about what hair testing is, so we can be somewhat on the same page. Now, elemental hair analysis provides really important information on the state of health at the tissue level and even the cellular level. And this is unique information that's not normally found through other forms of testing like blood, urine, or saliva, this sort of thing. It includes some specific conditions that are somewhat difficult to evaluate otherwise as well. So as we've mentioned before, there's obviously the heavy metal burdens, but also like tissue copper status, because blood testing for copper is actually not that accurate, whether you're looking at serum copper or even ceruloplasmin. It's kind of not the best test. It's actually really poor testing copper status in the blood. We can also look at things like advanced aging or calcification and chronic fatigue and chronic exhaustion, which is becoming somewhat of an epidemic nowadays. And as I've already mentioned, the tissue thyroid status. So it's somewhat invaluable in that its capacity to move the needle for those chronic health conditions that are oftentimes very difficult to improve otherwise, because it gives you insights that you wouldn't normally get from typical testing. Now, as a screening test, elemental hair analysis has enough value kind of as a sole means of testing. So you can just use this as kind of like an introduction to testing with your clients, or as a sort of a test that becomes a gateway outwards to assess whether or not there's different areas that are needed for investigation. So if you did a hair test or an elemental hair analysis and you see that the thyroid ratio might indicate an imbalance, then it might help you pursue testing the thyroid at the blood levels and get a better understanding of what's going on so that you can put the puzzle pieces together. Now, since it's relatively inexpensive, an elemental hair analysis, when you look at other functional medicine testing, you'll also find that it can be very helpful for our patients and clients because it can help them save money. And this drastically improves compliance when it comes to sticking with a practitioner or a medical doctor, because let's be honest, cost is a major factor, especially for people that have a lot of chronic health issues, because usually you're not the first person they've seen. And I know in my practice, I'm often like, maybe not the last, but they've gone through many practitioners before they get to me. And this does affect the client's ability to be able to comply to therapy. Another benefit of elemental hair analysis is that it does have a very quick turnaround. Now, once the lab receives the sample, it usually only takes a few days to get your results. And this is pretty cool because I know, especially in Australia, oftentimes we have to send testing out to, at least for a lot of the, vogue functional medicine testing, to America. And it's very convenient that LifeLine Diagnostics, especially for me, is in Poland. Now, another benefit of elemental hair analysis is that you can also use it to monitor patient progress. And you do this by doing repeat testing. And we usually recommend that clients retest their hair every 3 to 4 months. And you can use this to track progress, but then also ensure that they're taking supplements that their body still needs, rather than just guessing what you need to use. So the question obviously comes, why would we want to really test elements or even metals in the first place? And if you've ever read a book on biology or anything about a cell, you would know that nutritional elements especially are essential for life. We just can't live without them. And they're involved in almost every single biochemical process. And they are also essential for cofactors for other nutrients like vitamins, proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. If something happens in the body, usually you need minerals as the raw materials to kind of get the function going. So yeah, elements are the raw materials that are required for both the structure of the human body and as well as the function. If the function of our cells is not working in a healthy manner, then it's worthwhile to test at the cellular level to see what imbalances might be occurring so that we can address these imbalances and shift body chemistry to improve the function of the whole body, right? Now, a common example that I like to use is comparing the body's raw materials to the raw materials of building a house. So if you do not have enough nails, screws, or even wood, you just can't finish building a house. And the same is true for the cellular function. Our body requires the raw materials, these nutritional elements, for both its structure and for its function. Now, there are 4 primary methods for testing elements. They all have advantages and disadvantages. So whole blood is the most recognized, it's the most used test for assessing nutritional elements, but it doesn't provide the whole picture. It provides a snapshot of the transportation of elements to and from storage areas of the body. So it's only showing movement. It's not showing the nutritional status as at the tissue level. It can also provide, blood at least, can provide a false indication of balance, especially when a disease is present. And this is because mineral levels are kept at a relatively constant level in the blood, even when pathology is present. And this is because the body has innate mechanisms, homeostatic mechanisms that buffer the blood to make sure that everything's within good balance so that you can stay alive. So this balance, though, is maintained at the expense of the tissues. So tissues are like a reservoir. And the hair, which we're testing, is also a tissue. So it does reflect that tissue status. Now, even if you're testing erythrocytes or red blood cells, this does indicate intracellular activity, but it's only limited to one cell type, the red blood cell. And it's not going to reflect, liver cells or heart cells or any other, neurological cells, for example. Testing urine as well is can be used to identify a person's tissue level, but it's not always ideal since it's only showing what's being eliminated from the body. It's like looking at a garbage bin on the side of the road. You can't always use the information from inside that garbage bin to assess what is in the person's home, right? The same as with urine, it's elimination. So it's what's leaving the body. Now, it is true that to some degree you can do loading tests to assess somewhat nutritional status. This is things like, loading iodine or boron and then testing how much is eliminated so that you can assess, if the body's deficient, but this is somewhat controversial. Then, of course, there's hair testing. Now, hair is a good analysis. Hair analysis is a good indicator of metabolic processes that are occurring within the cell and also the intracellular storage of nutritional reserves. It also shows us a compilation of events that occurred over a period of time. So it's an average of metabolic activity. And to some degree, it is a minor excretory route. So it can indicate somewhat of what's being eliminated, but in general, it does reflect what's moving through the blood. And therefore, if it's in the blood, it's usually going to the tissues. So hair is beneficial for this reason. It also provides a long-term reading of what's going on. So it's more of an overview of what's going on in the tissue level, while blood tests and urine tests are more instantaneous readings of what's going on and what's being eliminated in the body. So hair is one of the most metabolically active tissues in the body, and it can provide a permanent record for metabolic activity since during its formation, it's exposed to the internal environment of the body including the blood, extracellular fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, and even the lymphatics. Now, as hair starts to make its way out, because it grows, it's not technically living, but it's growing out from the surface of the skin, the outer layers start to harden and it locks in metabolic products that occurred during its formation. And those metabolic products are what are coming from the bloodstream. So since hair typically grows 1 centimeter each month, um, and a typical hair sample is usually 3 to 4 centimeters. It can be a little bit longer, but the 3 to 4 centimeter range is really good because it would show you an average of what's occurring over 3 to 4 months, and it would show you an average of that metabolic activity. Now, this makes it a really good indicator of recent intracellular activity and the storage over that time period. So elemental hair analysis is really a mineral biopsy, and hair is a really excellent tissue for this because it locks things in its keratin formation and it can remain viable for many years. Maybe you've learned, Mozart had his hair tested to see what elements were in there. And other, like Ötzi, the Iceman, also had his hair tested to see what kind of elements the people would have been exposed to, 10,000 years ago. And that's how stable hair is as a tissue. Blood, not so much. You need special care to make sure that it maintains its quality. Now, collecting a hair sample is actually really simple. And one of the benefits is that it doesn't really require a lot of special training. And you can do it in the clinic. When your client comes in for an initial intake, you can cut the hair sample there with them, with their permission, obviously. And it's very simple to do. So it's not like you need to have certain certifications to do blood drawing, for example. It is also an important thing is that it's non-invasive, so it doesn't cause harm. And, we make this Hippocratic oath of, do no harm. So it's very much in tune with the Hippocratic Oath. Now, it's also important to follow the guidelines that are offered by LifeLine Diagnostics that come with your elemental hair analysis test kit to make sure that you do collect the sample properly. But once you get the hang of it, you'll find it's very simple to do. But the basics of it is that using hair from the head, the scalp, is the best as far as your nutritional status, in my opinion, at least. But the hair needs to be chemically untreated. So you don't want to have it permed or dyed or bleached. If the hair is chemically treated, I usually recommend that the clients wait, 6 to 8 weeks, just so that the new hair can grow in. And then you want to take a sample of that new virgin hair. And this is so that you can provide a sample to the lab that doesn't have any contaminants, because to get the most out of an elemental hair analysis, you want to make sure that you have a good sample. Now, I have had clients, that still test their hair with dyes, or they use specific medicated shampoos. And sometimes it's just part of the process. You end up using it inevitably, but in general, you want to make sure you provide a nice clean sample. You also need to be mindful of different possible sources of external contamination that can affect the hair. And as I said, medicated shampoos is a very common contamination. Head and Shoulders, for example, this brand that people often wear for dandruff, for example, can skew zinc levels on a hair test. But to be honest, I haven't really seen that too much in my practice. The worst, contaminants are things like Selsun blue, because it's got selenium, and because hair, the keratin, the sulfur bonds in there are cysteine rich. It just absorbs that selenium. So you'll often find very high selenium levels on hair tests when someone uses Selsun blue. Other really notorious ones are things like Grecian Formula, which is like a hair darkening shampoo, and Restoria is another one. And they use lead in the formation of the shampoo. For whatever reason, they say it's safe by putting lead on your hair, but it will contaminate the hair sample when you send it to the lab. And like you might get a message from LifeLine saying, this is very high. So just some things to keep in mind, that it definitely can have contaminations here. In general, because when you're doing a hair sample, you want to make sure that you do clean, dry hair, and you want to try and cut the sample somewhere between 4 to 12 hours after washing the hair, like you typically would with just a simple shampoo. Baby shampoo works really well, or even Dr. Bronner's is a brand name, or some sort of very simple soap. You don't need to use conditioner or any other hair product that's added to it, because this is all potential sources for contamination of the hair sample. Now, the hair itself, the best place to cut it is the occipital region, just right around the ear, just above there, on the base of the skull. And usually the sample length is about 3 to 4 centimeters. And this is to help provide the most recent metabolic activity that's going on with your clients. But I will say that if you do a recent hair sample, 3 to 4 centimeters, and you find very elevated, say, arsenic or mercury, then you can actually test the hair further down to confirm if maybe it was just a recent exposure that they were exposed to over a 3 to 4 month period, or if it was a chronic exposure that the person might be exposed to. And then if you definitely find very high toxic metals, especially in someone, then you want to send a pubic hair sample to confirm that it's not just some sort of external contamination onto the scalp. Now, one of the benefits of using LifeLine Diagnostics is that, the lab protocol really matters. So once the hair reaches the laboratory, it's important to emphasize that that the labs that you use to test your hair shouldn't wash the sample. And if you do the proper sample protocol that we've mentioned, using clean hair 4 to 8 hours after washing it, they shouldn't need to wash it at the lab. Now, the reason for this is that excessive washing at the lab itself can wash away a lot of extracellular elements that are meant to be a normal they're meant to be on the hair as part of the normal composition. So this can affect things like sodium levels, but even potassium levels on the hair test. And it can affect mostly electrolytes. But we find, and as we go forward when we get into ratios, you'll find that these are very important when it comes to the assessment of an individual's health. Now, this is also important because different labs have different protocols, and some might wash it 6 times, some might do it 8 times, some might use an acetone or Triton X or something, and the other lab won't. So that there can be inconsistencies in results, which obviously causes issues if every lab's doing different protocols. So not washing it creates a nice level playing field for everybody to have accurate results of what the hair indicates. So to obtain the most, important, the most relevant information, we want to make sure that we're using samples that haven't been washed at the lab. And LifeLine Diagnostic has assured me that they don't wash the sample, so this is ideal. So if you use a LifeLine Diagnostic elemental hair analysis for your hair samples, you can use the interpretation information that I will be presenting today. So let's dive into some of the information to help you interpret the results of an elemental hair analysis. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it does take, a lot of experience to really learn all of this information. But today I will try and cover some things that you can start to use in your practice immediately. Now, elemental hair analysis offers, I can't emphasize enough, very highly valuable data clinically, because by but it needs to be interpreted properly. If the interpretation of the hair analysis, it's not always taken at face value. You can't always just say, oh, something's high, therefore we need to avoid it, or something's low, therefore we need to supplement it. It doesn't work so much in that way. So it's not very intuitive at first. So the learning curve can be a little bit stark initially. But the elemental hair analysis, one of the things we need to make sure that we say is that it doesn't measure the total body content of any element. So you won't ever do a hair test and be able to assess, a total mercury load for an individual or something. And really, there's no test to do this unless you test the ash of a human, which usually it's a little late to do a nutritional program by that point. Now, it is important also to remember that the levels of the elements that are found in the hair are an average of what happens over a period of time. So it's over that usually 3 to 4 centimeter, 3 to 4 month kind of period of time. So every time we do a hair test, we're kind of looking a little bit into the past and using that information to shift the person in the future. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that practitioners that aren't trained in elemental hair analysis is that they read the levels at face values, as I said, meaning that if they see high calcium, then they might evaluate this and say, well, a person has excess calcium in the body, so maybe we won't use it as a supplement, or you should avoid anything that's high in calcium, because honestly, it's often the opposite of that. Usually when you find an elevated element, oftentimes, not always, it does mean that you need to incorporate it in the person's nutritional program, because it's often seen as a loss or a biounavailability or a compensation or a protective mechanism why it's elevated. Or you find something, an untrained practitioner might see a very low iron level. And oftentimes, especially clients, they're always looking at iron because it seems to be the most common one that people know about. But they presume that because their iron level's low, that they're likely anemic. And this can lead to some practitioners wanting to recommend iron supplementation, which might not actually be necessary. So it does take some time to learn this, and I don't want to try and overcomplicate it, but oftentimes you don't need to use iron supplementation to improve an iron status in the body. Oftentimes you need copper or B vitamins, or you need to improve the biochemical balance and nutritional cofactors so that iron can work better. So please keep in mind that whether or not you have a high or low level on an elemental hair analysis, it doesn't automatically mean you have higher or low levels in the tissues, and that they can appear high or low for many different reasons. Very often it's the case that we should supplement the thing that's elevated, and oftentimes you don't always need to supplement what's low. So trying to interpret mineral levels as they appear can kind of guide a clinical approach, but it's often inappropriate unless you're trained to do so, as it can lead to ineffective or possibly even harmful clinical results, because you might just keep loading someone up with iron and the iron level might not move, because that's not necessarily what iron indicates on a hair test. Now, I'm not saying this to discourage anyone from using an elemental hair analysis, but instead to educate you on how important it is to kind of get an understanding of the mineral data that we're reading about and what we're learning about, so that we can use this information to properly interpret a hair test, so that we can have it, the optimal experience with it in our clinic. So elements interact together in a dynamic and a complex system. And you can see in this image on the right here, it's very complex. And every time you supplement one mineral, it always has an effect on at least 2 other minerals. It can raise or lower another mineral. So you can see how complex it can get very quickly when it comes to just using isolated nutritional supplements like just selenium or just iron or something. Now, many practitioners approach a hair test results by trying to supplement what's low and all this kind of stuff. But this is really a form of what's called replacement therapy. And it can be helpful, especially in the short period. But as far as like reaching the optimal results or reaping, the most from a nutritional program, usually it's very limited in its approach. We see really great results in our clients when they start to incorporate the mineral balancing science. Which we do simplify things a little bit, but we won't have time to go too much into it today because it'll just be too much information. But I will say that clients can notice some benefits quite quickly, but it does take a lot of time to really improve a lot of chronic conditions because shifting tissue element status is not very quick. Just to raise selenium levels to say ideal, levels, for example, can take up to 9 months of taking it every single day. And that's like, you don't often want to go quicker than that, because if you take too high doses of things, and you can have negative experiences as side effects from doing so. So it does take a little while, but oftentimes you will notice improvements in your clients in the short period, while there's these longer lasting improvements in the long run as well. Now, the scope of what I can cover today is quite limited. I'm trying to cover as much as we can today. But I wanted to spend some time on ratios. And the reason why I wanted to spend time on ratios is because it has the most meaningful information as far as our integrating hair testing into our practice. Now, we need to remember that this information will only be relevant for the hair samples that are being tested at labs that don't wash the hair. So please, if you use a different lab that does wash the hair, I would honestly probably just disregard this information, because it will affect a lot of the electrolyte levels here. Now, the elemental ratios are amazing as far as, a parameter for health. It is a very simple thing, really. It's a very simple mathematical equation where you take two numerical levels of any two elements. So for example, you can have a calcium level of 1,000 parts per million and a potassium level of 50 parts per million. And if you divide these together, and you find a calcium to potassium ratio of 20. So it's very simple in its essence like that. Now, they're really important because in some ways they're more important than the mineral levels themselves, because they represent homeostasis of the body. They represent a homeostatic balance that the body is trying to keep over the period of the sample, so 3 to 4 months. Now, while most people focus on just single nutritional deficiencies, like, oh, you're deficient in zinc or magnesium, the truth of it is that individual nutritional deficiencies are quite rare. What's more common is nutritional imbalances. So you can have relative deficiencies. Now, for example, as you can see illustrated on this diagram on the left here, that when calcium, for example, when tissue calcium levels start to lower, this often increases magnesium tissue levels. And this can improve or contribute to an imbalance between calcium to magnesium, right? The ratio. Magnesium is a very potent antagonist to sodium. So taking magnesium can often lower sodium levels on a hair test, but this can also has another effect on potassium. So it can raise potassium. And this is just one example of lowering one mineral to raise another mineral. You can manipulate the levels of calcium, for example, to improve the levels of potassium or sodium, whatever one, with the same kind of information. Now, this is just one example. And in actuality, each element will affect at least 2 minerals and 2 vitamins. And it kind of goes out like, fractals. But it just gets too complex to get into everything in this presentation. But we can still say in general that any imbalance between nutrients within the body contributes to a host of health problems that are still not fully understood today and only just becoming recognized in the literature. So learning about mineral ratios is a really important step in the right direction. Now, LifeLine Diagnostic tests for 29 different elements. And there are over 800 ratios possible because if you 29 times 29. Now, but having information from hundreds of ratios on a hair test does not mean more relevant information. So we're only going to talk about the 6 most significant ratios, the ones that have the most meaning in our practice. This is calcium to magnesium, calcium to potassium, calcium to phosphorus, sodium to potassium, sodium to magnesium, and zinc to copper. So remember when I said that, elemental hair analysis can provide so many insights into multiple areas of the body? Well, as you will see, the 6 main ratios that I've just mentioned are the main providers of this information. Now, on the second page of the LifeLine Elemental Hair Analysis report, you'll find that there's a table that includes significant element ratios. Now, I've added a column on the left here just to show a simplistic meaning of what these ratios indicate. But LifeLine offers you the range that they consider relevant to interpret the ratios. So the information on the right is just as is from LifeLine's hair test report. Now, in mineral balancing, we do use specific ideal levels and ratios, but I won't be going into all of this today. But for now, you can just use the norms that are found at the lab because these are still a really good starting point. The first ratio that I want to talk about is the NAK ratio. And this is commonly called the vitality ratio, but really it reflects adrenal hormone status. It shows us the electrical potential of cells, and this electrical potential is regulated by sodium and potassium levels, and these are 2 electrolytes. And it's to some degree related to the sodium pump mechanism of the cell in current scientific thinking. But this can be debated. Not everyone believes in the pump mechanism of the cell. Nonetheless, sodium, potassium, the balance is still very important. Now, sodium and potassium themselves are regulated by hormones in the body, aldosterone for sodium and cortisol for potassium. Now, this may not always reflect with another type of test, but on a hair test, we find this to be the case. Both of these hormones are adrenal hormones. So sodium to potassium ratio and even the levels reflect adrenal gland hormones. The NAK ratio is, in my opinion, the most important ratio on elemental hair analysis. So it's the element, if you could only focus on one to really improve, to substantially improve your client's health, it's this ratio. So sodium and potassium, as we said, are they reflect the glucocorticoids. They are 2 very synergistic elements. They're often found together in the body, and the balance between these 2 elements is very important. If these elements are imbalanced, it indicates important physiological disturbances of the cell. This is why it's a priority really to correct. Now, sodium is primarily an extracellular element, while potassium is normally an intracellular element. So the balance is kind of like this inside-outside dynamic here. Now, the sodium-potassium pump is found on most cell surfaces, and it's powered by adenosine triphosphate. And this pump moves sodium and potassium ions in opposite directions. In a single cycle of the pump, 3 sodium ions are extruded and 2 potassium ions are imported into the cell. Now, the adrenal glands direct the kidney's regulation of sodium and potassium levels, and often when one rises, so too does the other. So you'll find sodium and potassium levels often rise together. If the kidneys cannot regulate the NAK ratio, then there's an imbalance of these 2 elements. So when there's an imbalance in the sodium to potassium ratio, hormones, glucose, amino acids, medications even, it's not very easy for these things to get inside of the cell because this exchange is not working properly. Now, an imbalanced ratio, the NAK ratio, is often associated, therefore, with things like heart issues because of the electrolytic functions, kidney because the levels themselves regulated there. And liver, it can provide information on liver, like liver inflammation, for example, and it can give us insights onto the immune system. Now, when the ratio is lower than 2, the person is generally in a state of exhaustion. But if, say, the levels themselves are also low, then the exhaustion will be even more extreme. So you find this really commonly in people that have burnout, or hypoadrenia, very low adrenal gland function. Now, if the sodium and potassium levels are high and the ratio is low, we would say that this is a person that's experiencing a secondary acute stressor, which is increasing adrenal gland function. But because the NAK ratio is low, we would still say that they were already in a state of an exhaustion, but they had a secondary stressor. Now, when you have an elevated NAK ratio, and to me, this is over 6, I think it's quite normal to see it somewhere between 2 and 4, to be honest. So when it's higher than that, 5, 6, this generally indicates excessive inflammation. And this can be for many different causes. It's just very simple and open. It's just inflammation. The next ratio is calcium to magnesium ratio. And this ratio gives us a picture of the cell's ability to metabolize carbohydrates, whether it's, a high or a low, this ratio, if it's high or low, it can indicate an imbalance. And it's not always clear enough to suggest, oh, it's just high or low blood sugar. It's simply just saying that there's an imbalance with the person's ability to metabolize carbohydrates. Now, calcium and magnesium are both necessary for keeping each other in a solution in their ionic state. So any imbalance between either or can cause some issues here. Calcium is primarily an extracellular element. Magnesium is that intracellular, and that's that inside-outside dynamic again here. Both calcium and magnesium are just entangled with each other, and often they share similarities in symptoms when one or the other is out of balance. Nowadays, it's a little more common to see people just using a lot of magnesium supplementation, but they often overlook that some of those symptoms, especially if they're not being relieved by magnesium, could be from a calcium imbalance. So calcium is required for the release of insulin from the pancreas, and magnesium inhibits this. It stops the secretion of insulin. So if you consider that insulin is, what a diabetic takes to lower their blood sugar level, calcium can therefore lower the blood sugar of a person. And magnesium is kind of like the stop switch. Both high and a low calcium magnesium ratios are very much correlated with the same kind of symptomatology. In general, it's just an impairment of glucose metabolism, and this usually results in functional hypoglycemia or low blood sugar, or dysinsulinism, which is unstable blood sugar, and hyperglycemia or high blood sugar, diabetes, right? Now, generally a high ratio is due to consuming too much carbohydrates, and a low ratio is due to hypoglycemia. But I will say that it's just not always that simple. It's just not always the case. And you can have individuals with prediabetes, for example, with low ratios. So don't just take it at face value and the diagnostic means, but use it to help guide what's going on with your clients. In addition, a disturbance in the normal balance between calcium or magnesium can also result in muscle contraction or relaxation. So you can have, oftentimes with a higher or low ratio here, muscle spasms, right? Even arrhythmias of the heart, because the heart's a muscle. Now, an elevated calcium to magnesium ratio is also very well correlated with the coronary artery calcium score. And this is just a bonus of, an elemental hair analysis, is because it can help guide us down the road, which could be potentially life-saving for our clients, if you know how to use that information, of course. Now, this is especially the case with calcium, because calcium at the tissue is correlated with tissue calcification. And so that's how we can get this information on the coronary artery calcium score. Let's spend some time on zinc to copper. Now, zinc and copper, this ratio is very difficult to limit to like a single meaning. It could be called the hormone ratio because, progesterone and estrogen balance, or testosterone and estrogen. It could be the brain ratio, whether or not you're using primarily neocortical function or the diencephalon. It could be the heart ratio or even the infection ratio. But it's much more relevant, in my opinion, to use this ratio to evaluate copper and zinc status, more so than just the copper or zinc levels themselves. So you will often find an elevated zinc to copper or a low zinc to copper, and this can give us indication of whether or not we want to use more zinc or more copper to help shift this ratio in the right balance. Now, both elements are related to the antioxidant activity of superoxide dismutase, and that's a very potent enzyme in the body and anti-inflammatory indicator. So getting a good balance of zinc to copper is very important, especially with people with chronic inflammation. Zinc, as far as hormones, it oftentimes correlates with progesterone, especially in women, but to some degree it can be as well in men. But zinc usually is correlated with testosterone in men. And it can technically also indicate that in a female. Copper is generally reflecting estrogen. And so we can often find that some people have imbalances, right? Estrogen is not just a female thing. You can have men that have higher estrogen levels than females and females with higher testosterone than men. And you can use a hair test to kind of figure this out a little bit. Now, what's most important is that there must be a balance between, copper and zinc. When an imbalance occurs, then a person becomes more prone to infections. And this is very relevant in today's age, especially when everybody is taking excessive amounts of, say, zinc, because it can affect your copper status. Now, zinc is antiviral, while copper is, more so antibacterial and antifungal, but it does have some degree of antiviral. But generally speaking, zinc is antiviral, copper is antibacterial, antifungal. When this ratio is elevated, so a high zinc to copper ratio, it often indicates a need for antifungals or increased copper intake to help improve the status here, or at least protect the person's immune status to, these microbial growths. When the ratio is low, so we say, below 6.5, we often find that zinc is relatively low to copper, and this is common in individuals with a viral load such as Epstein-Barr virus, but also others as well. It's also really common when it's a low ratio to find individuals that are estrogen dominant, and thus it could be very helpful to also consider this as far as using, say, DIM or indole 3-carbinol or sulforaphane or something to help metabolize this excess estrogen a little bit better. The sodium to magnesium ratio on the hair test is the adrenal ratio, and we've already said that, sodium on a hair test is associated with aldosterone, an adrenal hormone, and this regulates sodium in the body. Now, the higher the sodium, we usually say the higher the aldosterone, at least at the tissue level. Now, sodium itself is a very volatile element, while magnesium is a relaxant. So the balance between sodium to magnesium are somewhat antagonistic. As one goes up, often the other goes down. So it's very common to find an imbalance between these, at least on this ratio here. It often won't reflect, perfectly blood or saliva tests because, the latter measure hormones or their metabolites in blood or saliva, but the hair test measures the cellular and tissue effect. So they usually don't correlate entirely, but you can find that they're, at least from what I've found, at least, Dutch tests can somewhat correlate to the hair test. So dried urine. Now, a high sodium to magnesium ratio, to me at least, is above 8, and this is indicative of hyperadrenia, so overactive adrenal gland function. It's not extremely common to find this in modern day, but you do see it, especially in individuals that had a lot of stress that's going on. Usually it's before their adrenal gland function depletes. You'll also find an elevated sodium to magnesium ratio in those sodium sensitive, hypertensive individuals. And taking advantage of knowing that magnesium is very antagonistic to that might be, hey, maybe magnesium might be helpful for this client to lower sodium. A low ratio indicates hypoadrenia or low adrenal gland function. And it's commonly found in those with magnesium retention in the cells. Now, this doesn't always mean that they don't need magnesium, but it just means that their tissues are somewhat elevated. And you can find that these individuals usually still have things like hypoglycemia, since cortisol is important for balancing blood sugar. So when you have low adrenal function, usually you're going to have blood sugar imbalances. And this is very common to find that low ratio in someone that just needs to eat every 2 hours. Otherwise, they, have increased symptoms. Now, the adrenal glands supply the fuel to the cells for the cellular energy production, and it does this by raising blood sugar. So the cells can uptake this glucose and then use it to create adenosine triphosphate, right? Biochemical energy. So the adrenal function is very important as far as energy production. Now, the second last ratio here is calcium to phosphorus ratio. And this indicates the state of the autonomic nervous system. This reflects the different branches. And so calcium is more reflective of this parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, because calcium is somewhat relaxing and sedating and calming and numbing. But phosphorus usually reflects the activity of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, because it's more fiery, right? It's more stimulating to the nervous system. A high calcium to phosphorus ratio is often due, at least in my experience, to inadequate intake of calcium in the diet, and this can lead to bone depletion. It's common for these individuals to have a pear-shaped body, so they're like bigger around the thighs, and these individuals often need more calcium and perhaps even more magnesium to help calm this excessive nervous system activity. So it helps kind of chill them out. It's the chill pills, right? And it does this when these individuals are often overstimulated, then you'll find that they have an excessive dorsal vagal complex dominance. So if you're into polyvagal theory, you'll know that there's an unhealthy parasympathetic dominance that can occur. And oftentimes they need something to calm them down because they're so stimulated and they get a little overactive. Now, a low calcium to phosphorus ratio is correlated with sympathetic dominance and an apple-shaped body, so they hold a lot more weight in their belly area. And you'll see individuals often like this in your practice. Now, phosphorus in a hair sample usually suggests protein and amino acid status, because that's usually where you find a lot of phosphorus in the diet. And inflammation burns up protein because it breaks things down. So a decline or an elevation in this ratio can really be affected when there's a lot of protein destruction, and you'll usually find an elevated ratio here, elevated calcium to phosphorus ratio. So this ratio can, when it's elevated especially, usually indicate inadequate protein intake, or even a vegetarian diet that's not really being utilized to its best ability, so that you might need to either work on improving protein digestion or even limiting anti-acid uses and things like this, because your body, it's indicating that the body's not breaking down this protein properly to rebuild the muscle in the body. You can also have serious infections that affect this ratio, or even more chronic health conditions, and it's usually just because these individuals are just run down. Now, the last ratio is the calcium to potassium ratio. This is the thyroid ratio. And this is one of the really important ratio as far as hair testing goes. So in mineral balancing, we identify calcium and potassium as two really important elements that regulate the thyroid gland function. So calcium somewhat slows down the creation of metabolic energy, while potassium speeds it up. So cellular calcium can desensitize like the cell membrane. So it's like blocks the ability of the cell to receive thyroid hormone from the blood. So you often find elevated levels of hormones in the blood, but the cellular level it's very low because they can't get in because of this calcification that occurs. Well, potassium increases the sensitization of the cell membrane and therefore increases this thyroid hormone uptake into the cell. So the better potassium levels, the more overactive thyroid you can actually have. Now, for the thyroid gland to operate at its, maximum capacity and its healthy capacity, there has to be a balance between these two elements. Now, if a person has too much calcium compared to potassium in the tissues, they will have an underactive thyroid gland at the cellular level. And this is a calcium-potassium ratio greater than 6. Now, in contrast, if a person has too much potassium relative to calcium in their tissues, they would have a low calcium to potassium ratio. So it would be below 3 usually. And this indicates an overactive thyroid gland at the cellular level. Now, we all know thyroid affects many different systems in the body, like digestion or cardiovascular health, the ability to metabolize fats, carbohydrates, proteins, and affects, body weight, heart rate, blood pressure, so many different things. So getting an understanding of this calcium potassium ratio can provide a lot of insights into helping our clients. Now, I will say that it often doesn't always correlate with the blood thyroid tests because hair is a tissue, but blood tests usually often indicate a normal thyroid status for most people unless their thyroid is really out of balance. Whereas an elemental hair analysis will often indicate an imbalance in the thyroid function before these blood tests will. And oftentimes you'll find these clients come to you, they want their thyroid test because they have all the symptoms, but the blood test doesn't say anything. Well, oftentimes you'll find the hair test does, and you can start to address it before it becomes a big problem. And this is one of the major values of going to a functional medicine practitioner. Now, ratios can also be a really good indicator to assess an individual's progress. So, of course, you have to take into account, the rest of the test as well, but including the levels, mineral levels, but and symptoms. But oftentimes an improvement in ratios usually show an improvement in the person's metabolic functions and the homeostatic mechanisms. Now, I will say that very often you will have at least one ratio that looks worse. And this is kind of just the nature of the balancing process. When you start to work with things, you're bound to have one or two ratios that look a little worse, and person might feel a lot better. But it doesn't usually indicate that a person is just worsening in their health or symptoms if this occurs. Another factor with worsening of a ratio is that toxic metal elimination can skew the results in a test. And this is very common, for example, with like elevations of cadmium or mercury or copper, and pretty much every other mineral, can have an effect on other mineral status. But the ones I mentioned, cadmium, mercury, copper, iron, manganese, aluminium, nickel, these all can temporarily raise the sodium level on a hair test, and therefore it can impact the NAK ratio, the sodium to potassium, and the sodium to magnesium ratio. So that vitality ratio and that adrenal gland ratio. All right, so let's put some of this information together onto what we're going to do is it on the example of the elemental hair analysis, because I'm not going to share a live case study today, but let's put it together on the LifeLine sample report here. So if we look at the NAK ratio here, we can see that the ratio is low. It indicates low adrenal gland function, often chronic fatigue, but not always. And we can also assume that there's going to be a low hydrochloric acid function when this ratio is low. So, with this information, we can often say, hey, a low NAK ratio, there's probably immune compromisation or some dysbiosis, low hydrochloric acid function, low adrenal function or fatigue. And you could use this kind of information to gauge, hey, maybe we should be using betaine HCl or some sort of hydrochloric acid supplement to help improve this balance here. Now the calcium to magnesium ratio, we can see, the ratio is too high, which often suggests that there's a relative magnesium deficiency, and that the person may be consuming a little bit too much carbohydrates. We might be able to also use this to indicate, risk for coronary calcium, and we could suggest, investigating this further with other testing, especially if the calcium level itself is elevated. So if we look at the levels, we can see that while this is outside, the normal reference range, the level is elevated, but I'll be honest, it can be way higher than this number here. You can have it upwards of 2,000 parts per million and even beyond, especially in individuals that are very fatigued. But calcium levels are a really good indicator of tissue calcium. And the higher the calcium level, the more difficult it is for nutrients, drugs, and even hormones to permeate the cell wall because it's calcified. It's like, a crustacean shell protecting. Now, the more calcified tissue, the more likely you'll find that glucose can't properly get into the cell. So you'll find that elevated blood sugar. We can also check the other levels of other elements that are known to be important for blood sugar metabolism, such as chromium, manganese, and even vanadium. And you can see that all these levels are low. So when we're working on correcting these elements to improve the person's carbohydrate intolerance, we can also see that, the calcium magnesium ratio is elevated, but also you need to work on the manganese, you need to work on the vanadium and the chromium. And these could be a means of supplementing these nutrients to help improve the person's carbohydrate tolerance. Now, the zinc to copper ratio for this individual, the norm at the lab says somewhere between 6.4 and 9.6. We can see that this patient's results 17. So this ratio is high, and this can indicate a relative copper deficiency. Now, copper may be an important supplement also because it can help improve a sodium to potassium ratio due to it being antifungal and antibacterial, because those are properties of copper, and because supplementing copper itself can raise sodium on a hair test. So it can be a very important nutrient to use to help shift the body chemistry in the right direction. Now, low sodium to magnesium ratio usually suggests low adrenal gland function. We've talked about this quite a few times with sodium and the importance of sodium as an adrenal glucocorticoid. So when we see the low adrenal gland ratio here, we can also say, hey, this agrees with the findings that we found with the sodium potassium ratio, where there's likely fatigue or even some exhaustion going on. Now, when you do find a low adrenal gland ratio, you can use this information to help provide, maybe an adrenal glandular to help support the adrenal function in the body, and it's like helps like. Or you can use a herb to help support the adrenal gland function to either stimulate the adrenal gland to kind of get the hormones working a little bit better here. You'll find that this calcium to phosphorus ratio on this example client here is slightly elevated. It's not too far out of balance. This can indicate increased need for phosphorus. So you might make a recommendation, hey, maybe more proteins needed. Of course, that we know they need digestive support, so we want to provide that digestive support to help break down that protein. Or you can use this information to say, hey, maybe there might be somewhat of a calcium deficiency that's causing the calcium to be elevated because of an overactive parathyroid gland function. And in this case, you would say, hey, let's maybe use like calcium phosphate or some sort of calcium that provides phosphorus as well to help normalize the parathyroid function. Now, if you recall earlier, I mentioned how you cannot always just look at an element level at face value. So calcium is an excellent example of this. Now, calcium levels on an elemental hair analysis is actually high, usually because of something called biounavailability. So when there's a biounavailability of a nutrient, you can have elevated levels in some areas of the body, while it's low in other areas of the body. So elevated calcium on hair test often indicates buildup of calcium in the soft tissues. And the higher the calcium level, the more prevalent this tissue calcification is. So the calcium level appears high in the hair, but the person's bone is very likely being depleted of calcium by a parathyroid hormone to maintain blood homeostasis. And the higher the calcium level on a hair test, the more you need to supplement with it. So it's counterintuitive in this way. Or at least increase dietary calcium, at least up into the recommended daily allowance, which is usually at least 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium to stop this compensation that's occurring because of the parathyroid. Now, to improve the body's ability to utilize, calcium and make it more bioavailable, it's really important to also provide other nutrients than just calcium. Bone's made up of 44 minerals. It's not just calcium, but calcium is a major part of it. But we also want to provide nutrients like magnesium, sodium, and potassium. In some cases, vitamin K can also be very helpful, especially if a very elevated calcium, but it's not always needed in my experience. But it can be used. Sometimes it can lower the levels a little too good and cause low calcium status again on the hair test. B vitamins are also really important since one of the primary causes of tissue calcification is a cellular deficit of energy. So, providing the nutrients that the cells need to create energy can be very helpful for improving tissue calcification. Now, on this example here, we can also find that the calcium to potassium ratio is slightly high. And we can use this to identify the tendency for a low thyroid function, at least at the cellular level. And we might use this information to either provide some thyroid support or at least look at other elements which might affect the thyroid to see what's going on. So since we know, for example, that the thyroid is slightly under functioning on the hair test, we would look at things like iodine and selenium levels. And we can use this to assess whether or not these may be missing links for a healthy thyroid function. And we can see that iodine and selenium levels are both low, which correlates with the trend for hypothyroidism. And since you need iodine to make T4, thyroid hormone, and you need selenium for the essential function of converting T4 to the biologically more active, at least, thyroid hormone T3, then you can also see that there's other information that's suggesting, hey, there actually is a lower thyroid function here. And this might also encourage you to maybe do a blood test to see if it's also occurring on the blood, and then you can work with your client to whether you use medication or not, that's between you guys, but at least you can use a hair test to kind of guide what's going on here. All right, I've covered a lot already. I think we're still okay for time. 14 minutes, is that right? I think so. So we're going to go into the heavy metal detoxification and elemental hair analysis. So, so far I briefly introduced the most important ratios on an elemental hair analysis. Now let's spend the rest of this time together discussing one of the primary reasons that most practitioners use hair testing, and this is to assess heavy metals, detoxification or heavy metal status. At the end of this presentation, I will share with you some of my favorite approaches to detoxifying metals as well. Now, toxins and inflammation usually function, toxic metals and inflammation usually function as oxidant catalysts. So they produce oxidative stress from, free radicals in cell membranes, tissues, organs, this sort of thing. And as a result, it impairs cellular function, which has a whole host of effects. It can affect many different functions in the body. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. This is just a list that shows common indications of congestion, of detoxification pathways, and even to some degree, a toxic element burden. Now, many toxins are fat soluble and affect us in one of three ways. There's toxicologically, so if they affect our nerve and brain, so then they cause disorders. And since many toxic elements are damaging to this sort of tissues. Immunologically, so allergies, autoantibodies or Hashimoto's kind of states, altered abilities of our immune function. So we might not be able to protect our bodies enough from different infections like bacteria, viruses, and candida, parasites, worms, whatever. And it can also affect a healthy functioning of our cells. So you can also have rogue cells, right? Cancer kind of things come up as a result of toxic metal burdens. The other way that toxins can affect us is pathophysiologically. So they can impair kidney function or affect adrenal hormones or thyroid function, which then can have systemic effects in other areas of the body. Now, toxic elements are easier to detect in hair than in blood. And since they're not found in high concentrations in the blood, usually, unless you've just been exposed to like an acute exposure, then hair can be really meaningful for assessing toxic metal status over a period of time. Now, toxic metals, just like nutritional elements, are still subject to the homeostatic functions of the body. So, the body oftentimes, when it's exposed to these toxic elements, tries to move them to locations where they do the least amount of damage, at least in the short term. So toxic elements that can't be eliminated usually exit the blood and accumulate in tissues, including the hair, because the body doesn't want it in the blood because it'll affect the heart. So it'll put it in an area where it's not going to cause as much harm. Now, heavy metals showing up on a hair test can indicate either a recent or a past exposure, in which case the metals that were previously stocked in the tissues were recently excreted. So you can have you might have been working on your nutritional status and you might find increased toxic metals on a hair test because they're coming out of the tissues, moving through the blood. And then you might find elevations just from a detoxification protocol, but you can also find it because of past exposures and even recent exposures. So if you just got exposed to a lot of arsenic or aluminium or something, you'll find the elevations on the hair. Now, many initial hair tests, meaning a person's first hair test, often show very little or even no metal excretions as far as toxic metals. And this doesn't necessarily mean that there's no heavy metal burden in the tissues, but this is a common misconception. So when the toxic elements are too low, you should be suspicious. Am I still presenting or? Yes,
yes. Sorry, Johnny. Pablo needs to add me to this conversation because we need to go to the end of the presentation. So
no
just
worries.
2 minutes more, okay?
2 minutes?
And so Pablo, please, 2-3 minutes because we have the second part with Q&A.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's fine, totally fine.
Okay. So Pablo, please give John opportunity to share the screen.
So we're gonna fly by as quick as we can. That's okay. Okay, so yeah, oftentimes you'll find that individuals don't have very high toxic metals. And this is usually because they don't have the energy or they don't have the nutrients to really detoxify these things. So once you begin nutritional supplementation, you'll often find an increase in toxic metals on the next hair tests. And this is usually a good sign as long as you're not having recent exposures to more toxic metals. Now, oftentimes people do use chelation therapy, but this can have a lot of negative effects on the body. Like, if someone doesn't have open detoxification pathways, it can negatively affect the body or generally weaken them. And the better way of kind of approaching this is by using nutritional support to really help open up detoxification pathways, improve cellular function, and even antagonize the function at the cellular level and block the absorption and this kind of thing. We use something called biological replacement of elements. And this is basically that the body prefers nutrients over toxic metals. So once you provide what the body needs, it'll let go of what it no longer needs. And it's a very natural approach to detoxification. Now, oftentimes you'll find, for example, calcium and lead being displaced by each other. So this is just one common example and why we can find people having a depletion in bone and then a buildup of things like toxic metals of lead that start to accumulate in the bone. Now, when we really start to improve a person's body with nutritional functions, with nutritional supplementation, we will usually find toxic metals start to come out. And therefore, usually we say it's either being released from the bone or from the tissues. And oftentimes you can have negative symptoms that occur as a result of using a nutritional program. Now, this is a wheel that I put together, and this is basically to outline simple nutritional antagonisms that are backed by clinical studies, things that are freely available on PubMed. And you can use this information if you find your clients are high in toxic metals. You can use them to shift the body chemistry in the right way. So if someone has a lot of lead, you can use selenium or vitamin C or even iron to block this lead in the body. And it works in this way. And you can find this on our website, mineralbalancing.org. So that concludes our presentation. So if you're interested in learning more about hair testing, I offer a lot of free information on mineralbalancing.org. And of course, we have our podcast on YouTube. We also, use a lot of this information in our own practice. So I know that it is very meaningful. And I would like to thank everyone for watching us. And I'm happy to answer some questions if you guys have them.
Thank you very much, John. It was a great presentation. I think and I'm sure it was the first step to get to know a little bit more about the hair tests. So thank you very much. And now we'll go to the Q&A session with Dr. Musa. So Dr. Musa, please join us and provide this part.
Yes, thank you very much. If you allowed my video to share. Okay, thank you very much, John, for a presentation. It was a very interesting, scientific, and beautiful presentation about hair minerals and mineral toxicity as such. We have a few questions from the audience, and that question is, I would like to categorize questions. Some questions are how to collect the sample. Some questions are indications of hair mineral analysis testing, and certain questions are from clinical implementation or protocol, something like that. So I would like to start with the question, as you mentioned that, we have to collect the hair sample. So somebody is asking the question that can we collect a hair sample that is already lost? So example, somebody having a hair loss, and we can collect the lost hair as a sample, or we should take a new fresh sample?
So there's a big challenge with this. So if you use lost hair, it can be often very long, and it's hard to tell which side was the area closest to the scalp that was lost. So it wouldn't provide the best information, in my opinion, to use hair that's been shed. It's best to use the hair that's closest to the scalp that and cut the sample you can grow your hair nice and long, and it can be very, lovely, and still do hair testing. And I know this because my wife had her hair very long and she does testing regularly. But the best way is to just keep testing in the same spot.
That means you have to collect a fresh hair sample. That is the best way to go for testing. Also, somebody is asking the question like, if somebody using a swimming pool that contain a chlorine, so how often we have to wait before we collect a sample? So
For chlorine,
chlorine or somebody is using a swimming pool that affect the results of analysis, or we have to wait for certain time, then we collect a sample?
I don't think that it would really affect any levels that are tested at LifeLine. I think it can affect levels that, if they were tested for chlorine, maybe one day they will test for these noble, elements. But what you're more likely to find is sometimes people use things like copper in the pools, and that can definitely contaminate the sample, but I wouldn't worry about just chlorine. But if you have a high copper level, you might want to investigate to see if that's the culprit, because no matter how much washing you do, it's contaminated. It'll always just be high.
Yeah. And also another question from my side is, if we have to wash the hair with water before we collecting a sample, or it's just any time we can collect a sample? As you mentioned that we should not use a medicated shampoo, I know, but is the simple water cleaning of the hair is essential, or it's just an optional part? Your mic is mute. John, you are in mute.
There we go. Sorry, I muted. I shouldn't have. Could you say the question again? I was panicking because I muted myself.
Is just washing the hair with simple water is required, or it's just optional part? And we
Typical
can
water. Yeah, typical water does work. You can if it depends how picky you are, you can have, hard water and soft water, or even water that's gone through a water softener. Those can impact the results. More often the water softener, I find, does, but it can impact the results, especially if you are wondering why you have a high calcium and you can't seem to get it down. You might want to consider that. The best way really is distilled water, or like reverse osmosis water, chemically pure water. But when you work with clients, usually the harder it is to do the sample, the less likely they're going to want to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah, so best way is to not clean the hair, and just in the morning, once you wake up, just collect the hair. That's it.
Like, sample is better to have it. And even if it might have some contaminant, you can always ask them, hey, do you have calcium buildup in your kettle or something? And if they do, might be the common source for the calcium.
And so another question is from clinical indication of this kind of testing. So as you mentioned in your slide that sometimes the result doesn't reflect the body status of the minerals, like you mentioned in the calcium. So what are the real indication where we, just go for this kind of testing, hair mineral analysis testing?
So it just in general, it can be very helpful, but the more you learn, usually the more complicated things get, right? Very often you can take them at not entirely face value, but if you find an elevated level with calcium or something, I definitely would consider that to be an elevation. With things like potassium or magnesium, sometimes you need to do some questions to see if there's a reason why some of these elements might be appearing elevated because of a stressor, like sodium, for example, or a loss of potassium because of stress, or a loss of magnesium or zinc. They can be elevated and when the person actually needs some. So usually they're the stress-related elements: magnesium, zinc, sodium, potassium are the most common ones that you would kind of want to question for the face value one.
Yeah.
But zinc, copper, zinc, sometimes it can be elevated because of stress. Copper, manganese, those things are usually you can take at face value. But thanks for asking that question. It's a good one.
So, John, regarding your opinion, it is more of a nutrition that we should look at the hair minerals, or it's a more of an heavy metals or toxicity that we should look at hair mineral tissue testing?
It's best to look at the test as a whole, really, because
Well,
we're
yeah.
a whole human. But you can use information to get other information. So if you find an elevated mercury and then you wonder why a person has a low thyroid function, maybe there's a connection. And then conveniently, the body's very forgiving in that something that would help the thyroid would also help eliminate mercury, like copper or selenium or something, right? So, you know, if you're trying to get the most information, look at the ratios, and then even compare a nutrient level and a toxic metal together. So if you have a very low calcium to lead or something, that might be an indication, hey, there's a big lead issue. But, you know, usually you can just look at the ratios and get a lot of information.
Yeah. So in my clinical experience, we see a lot of patients with a high calcium and also the high lead level. And they usually have hypertension. So we have seen many correlation between the clinical presentation like hypertension with high level of calcium, and also they are lead toxic. Do you find any correlation with hypertension and high calcium or lead level?
Well, lead, I did mention in the presentation how lead can increase adrenal function and therefore it can raise sodium levels and then cause some correlations there with the sodium. So I do, to be honest, it's very common to find any toxic metal really to stimulate the effect on the sodium level, especially because they can have stimulating effects like cadmium, all of this stuff. That's why people love cigarettes and coffee and whatnot.
That's right. Nowadays, we are exposed to more often toxins in every diet, atmosphere, air pollution, water, and we are exposed to this kind of toxins. So really, this answered the question, and you are also mentioned beautifully about the all the ratio, like, and you mentioned sodium, potassium, sodium, calcium, and all the ratio. They are clinically significant with some kind of functions of the body, like adrenal function, all the functions you had mentioned. Now, really question is when we find out any kind of toxic metal that is high. For example, let's say somebody is asking in a group that his son is having a high aluminum. So do you have any idea, how we should start treatment? Like, we have to give
Yeah.
any kind of detoxification approach or any kind of chelating agent, or first we should start and like in minerals, we have to balance the mineral and then we can touch the toxicity. Can you throw some
Right.
light on
Yeah.
the clinical management of toxicity?
So the first step's always trying to reduce exposure. That's the number one, obviously. But sometimes you can't. Aluminium, it's everywhere. Laptops are made out of it. Drink everything. You add it to water to make it sparkle better. So it's prevalent. So this is where nutrition becomes very important, because nutrients aren't just needed to it'll help eliminate them from the body. They're also needed to block the absorption and block the function of them at the cellular level. So they're important for all the steps as far as toxic metals, how they work in the body. So the first thing is, regarding any heavy metal, look at increasing nutritional status in general. But then you will find that certain minerals or certain supplements have an affinity for certain toxic metals. Like zinc is very good for cadmium, or selenium and mercury, or selenium and arsenic, calcium and lead. But when it comes to aluminium is, like, to be honest, one of the easiest ones to eliminate. You're usually going to find it elevated because, as I said, it is everywhere. But the best thing to use in my experience is calcium, dietary calcium blocks absorption, but boron, very cost effective, very simple to make, even as a supplement. You can use borax. Boron's very effective at getting aluminium out of the body, especially in neurological tissue.
Yeah, that's very nice. So we can use in nutrition or other minerals to block the heavy metals and these things. And you had also, so all the audience, there is information in his website, so you can look at the mineral competition and all the other information
Yeah.
if you are looking to further study, further read and learn about the metal toxicity.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. And the last question I would like to address here is when you talk about the detoxification, do you think that we have to correct the digestive system or gut when we are thinking about the
Okay.
detoxifying any kind of minerals?
Yeah, you know, I think everyone just says you have to heal the gut. That's what everyone says. And no matter what it is, you work on the gut. It's a naturopathic principle to do that. The thing is it's not that simple just to say work on the gut, because you need minerals to help improve the function, but then you also need a good gut to digest the minerals. So it's kind of like two hands that are connected. So what we like to usually do is say, look, even if you have malabsorption issues or anything, provide the nutrients, give the body a chance at least. Don't just deprive them. If you need to work on gut, improving gut health, of course, address it with, you know, whatever you find works in your practice. There's many different perspectives on this. And as the gut health starts to improve, then the body will start to absorb these minerals a lot better. Now, some things like zinc are really important for hydrochloric acid production. And therefore, you need to provide the minerals. And I think that's a missing connection when it comes to improving gut health, is you do need nutrients for it to work. So I like to provide them. And sometimes, especially people with like really poor absorption, sometimes you have to provide more initially than you normally would, because you know they're only going to get 20% of it, right?
Yeah, John, thank you very much. That answer all the questions, and thank you very much for joining Indian Association of Functional Medicine. So, Marcin, last question people are asking is how to get this test done in India. So, if you can share your number or information about that, that would be really helpful for all the audience. You know, they want
Yeah.
to go for the testing. Yeah, Marcin.
The best place, as far as I know, for India especially, is LifeLine Diagnostics. I know I've had issues in the past with people that live in India to do hair testing, because they don't like to send the samples out of the country and stuff. So I would talk to Marcin. I think he would be the best person to get this. Of course, you can always reach out to us at mineralbalancing.org, but I think LifeLine is the place to go for this.
Yes, I just wrote my email and WhatsApp number on the chat, so you can contact directly with me, and we'll give you all needed information about how to collect hair samples or what is the price, etc., etc. So just feel free to contact directly with us. And yes, so guys, thank you very much. It was a great honor to have all of you here on our meeting. Dr. Musa, thank you very much for helping in organize this webinar and be a host in Q&A session. John, thank you very much for your lecture, for your presentation. It was great knowledge for all of us. And I hope that we'll do it again in near future, because there's a lot of knowledge to tell people, and I think it was really it will be really helpful for all of us. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time, for be with us, and see you in our next meetings and webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.